Hi, I'm Femi OK. Thanks for watching the stream. Today we are unpacking 15 years of Venezuela sanctions. How effective have they been and who's really impacted? Here's the former President Trump speaking on June the 10th.
How about we're buying oil from Venezuela? When I left, Venezuela was ready to collapse. We would have taken it over. We would have gotten all that oil. It would have been right next door.
Former President Trump saying the quiet bit out aloud. How impactful are sanctions? Good policy tool, or do they just collectively punish an entire nations for the deeds of their politicians? That is what we're talking about today. On YouTube, we are inviting you to be part of the conversation as well. The comment section is now live. Let's meet our expert guest. Joining us from Denver, Colorado, Francisco Rodriguez is an economist and professor at the University of Denver's Joseph Corbell School of International Studies. Joining us from Montevideo, Uruguay is Tamara Teresic Bona, director of the Peter D. Bell Rule of Law program at the Inter-American Dialogue. And in Washington, D.C., Mark Weisbrot. Mark is co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. So, Mark, in a sentence, 15 years of sanctions on Venezuela. What do we have today? What's been the result?
Well, the biggest part of the result is the worst decline in, the worst depression, really, in the history of Latin America, as Francisco will talk about. But I think also these sanctions are a form of economic warfare, and they mainly target the civilian population. And that's why they have an impact that's similar to actual wars. And a lot of people know this. Representative Jim McGovern, who was the chair of the House Rules Committee when the Democrats had the House, he wrote a letter to President Biden, and he asked him to get rid of these sanctions on Venezuela. And he said that the sanctions that they had were indiscriminate, and he said purposely so. So he explained how it was, as he said, the Venezuelan officials were not the ones who were suffering, but the people, and that was actually he explained how that was the purpose of the sanctions. And that is the purpose, I think, and it's illegal under treaties that we've signed, and it's terribly wrong.
Tamara, what's the purpose of the U.S. sanctions for 15 years?
I think there are two important points to clarify. First, there are different types of sanctions. Those that are targeted against specific government officials have no impact whatsoever on the humanitarian situation. But I believe we're talking here, and what Mark was referring to is the economic sanctions that have an impact on the oil sector. And what we have seen is that there's a problem with overcompliance with sanctions imposed by the US government that have made it harder for humanitarian aid to reach the country. However, I do think it's important to highlight that the humanitarian situation in Venezuela was pretty dire before the imposition of sanctions. Just look at official data by the health ministry published by the Venezuelan authorities in 2017 showed that the previous year, maternal mortality increased by 65% and infant mortality had increased by 30%. And these statistics, which had not been made public for a long time, were made public by a health minister that was quickly taken off office. So I do think we need to put the impact of the US sanctions in context in a situation that had been dire before and continues to be dire, in part due to overcompliance with the sanctions.
Tamara, on YouTube, one of our viewers has piped up immediately and says, this is basically American economic coercion. What would you say back to them as they're watching right now? Is this American coercion? Is that the whole point of sanctions on Venezuela?
I don't think sanctions need to be or should be an end in and of themselves. They should be a tool to try to improve conditions in the country. Obviously, if they have an impact on the humanitarian situation and on the people, they have an effect that no one is going to support. However, the imposition and the lifting of sanctions can be an important tool to promote a transition to democracy, together with other tools, including, for example, international accountability for grave human rights violations that have been committed in Venezuela and which amount to crimes against humanity.
Francisco, go ahead.
Sure. So Venezuela is undergoing the largest economic contraction ever documented in any country outside of wartime. It's a contraction of 72% of its income per capita. We're talking the equivalent of 3 Great Depressions. And what the evidence shows is that a large part of this contraction can be explained by economic sanctions. Now, it's not the totality of it, but what we have to understand is that this economy is very highly dependent on oil revenues. 95% of its exports are oil, it come from oil. And oil exports saw a 93% decline. And there have been several studies that have looked at the impact of sanctions on oil production and have found a very significant impact on oil production. So Venezuela is poorer right now as a result of sanctions. Now, again, sanctions are not the only driver, and Tamara is absolutely right that the situation was very complicated in Venezuela before sanctions. But sanctions have definitely added to the deterioration and have turned what was a large economic crisis in 2016 into the largest catastrophe that we've ever seen outside of wartime.
Francisco, I'm going to tell our audience that you're the founder of Oil for Venezuela. That's a non-profit organization, and you're focused on finding, you can finish the sentence here, what are you focused on finding?
On finding solutions to Venezuela's humanitarian crisis. And particularly, we're focused on developing frameworks that can serve for negotiated agreements so that Venezuela's government and the opposition can find ways in which they can address some of the country's most urgent problems. For example, through an oil for essentials programs that allows the country to regain access to U.S., European oil markets with the condition that the resources that are produced as a result of those exports are oriented towards attending the needs of Venezuelans under international supervision.
All right, so I want to bring in this extra voice. We spoke earlier to Daniel Di Martino. And Tamara, I want you to have a listen to Daniel, then respond immediately off the back of what he told us earlier. Here he is.
The reason Venezuela is in the terrible economic crisis it is today has nothing to do with US sanctions and everything to do with the terrible socialist policies they implemented. They took over people's businesses, they destroyed the private sector. So what else did we expect than forcing 7.3 million people like myself to flee our country? And so I really question the motives of members of Congress that are calling for an end to sanctions that don't affect the Venezuelan population, because today you can send food, medicine, cash, you can travel to Venezuela because it's not the same as Cuba. The sanctions only affect the crooks at the top that destroy our country, and those should continue.
Well, I think, things are not black and white. And as Francisco was saying, there are different aspects that impact on economic conditions and the situation, the humanitarian situation in the country. One that we haven't mentioned that I think is critical is the track record of mismanagement by Venezuelan authorities that also has an impact. And, before the sanctions, when the Venezuelan authorities did have money that was a consequence of selling oil, they didn't necessarily use it for the good of the people. So there's absolutely no guarantee that that money would have been funneled to actually support the humanitarian situation. And then an additional point that I think is critical is history shows that Venezuelan authorities don't give concessions for free, and that there needs to be leverage and generating incentives for that negotiation that Francisco was talking about between the opposition and government to actually happen, to get them to sit back at the negotiating table, to get them to agree to specific measures to help the people and to transition to democracy, and then eventually to implement those agreements. So I think it's essential to push in that direction through all possible means, including using sanctions. But I do think that the way they were presented by the Trump administration initially, with the statement that all options were on the table, including a possible military intervention, was definitely unhelpful to push for a response that would actually take Venezuela to democracy, which is what we all look for.
Francisco, Is it what we all look for? Is it for the US to impose democracy on other nations, on other countries? Is it for the US to make that decision and then make sure economically they can't thrive if they don't follow what the US tells them to do?
Well, I don't think it is, but I think that the rest of the international community doesn't think that it should be either. And there's something really important and sometimes overlooked about sanctions on Venezuela, which is that the U.S. is the only country that has imposed economic sanctions on Venezuela. And by that, I mean sanctions restricting Venezuela's sales of oil, sanctions restricting Venezuela's access to the global financial market. It's only the U.S. Europe has been actually quite clear in this, in rejecting economic sanctions and focusing only on personal sanctions. However, the U.S., despite being just 1/5 of the world economy, is incredibly powerful because the U.S. controls access to the U.S. financial system and to a capacity to carry out transactions in dollars. And 80% of global transactions occur in dollars, in U.S. dollars at the current time. So basically what happens is that, and the way in which the U.S. enforces sanctions, it's not just the U.S. saying you can't sell oil in my market. It's the U.S. saying if there is a European firm, a Spanish firm, a French firm, an Indian firm that decides to buy Venezuelan oil, that decides to help sell Venezuelan oil, or that provides inputs for the Venezuelan oil industry, we will sanction them also. So there's an incredible power, an incredible force that's being used by the U.S. And I think what's really objectionable about this is that I have absolutely no disagreement and fully in agreement with the U.S. targeting individuals, Nicolas Maduro himself and people in his regime, particularly those who on which there is evidence that have been involved in human rights abuses and in corruption. But targeting the Venezuelan economy is something different. Targeting the Venezuelan economy means targeting vulnerable Venezuelans. And I think that there's something really wrong about saying we're going to hold Venezuelans hostage. We're going to hold the well-being of Venezuelans hostage until Maduro decides to change his mind and negotiate.
I want to go to the US border and just bring in two migrants who have been forced for economic reasons to leave their country. This is them speaking in early May, and then I'm going to just bring back Mark here, because if this is an infringement of international law, these sanctions that are making people leave their own country, then what happens? Let's listen to the migrants first.
No, I have not thought about turning myself in because many friends have turned themselves in and have been taken to Mexico. In Mexico, they are practically killing us. Several girls have been kidnapped in Tijuana.
I don't want to go back to Venezuela because if there's breakfast, there's no dinner. If there's lunch, there's no dinner. And there are no shoes for the children. For medicines, people are dying. And mainly, I want to give my children a better quality of life.
Mark, can you explain why international law is being broken?
Yes, well, first of all, you have a whole set of treaties that the United States has signed, the UN Charter, the Charter of the Organization of American States, the Geneva Conventions. All of those prohibit the use of sanctions that target civilians, that harm civilians, that kill. And I want to emphasize that they kill civilians. You know, in the first year of sanctions, the mortality of Venezuelans, the Trump sanctions from 2017 went up by 40,000 deaths. Okay, so it's tens of thousands of people that have died from these sanctions at a minimum, and because that's just the first year. And so I think that this is really important. This is the most important thing. They get away with this because most people don't realize that. You know, other people have admitted this. Here's Mike Pompeo, okay, from a press conference when an Associated Press reporter asks him, how are the sanctions going in Venezuela? And he says, well, I think things are really going good for the Venezuelan people. He said, the humanitarian crisis is tightening by the hour. You can see the increasing pain and suffering that the Venezuelan people are suffering from. That was his exact words. And he said the same thing about Iran. And they make it, he didn't hide it, okay? For the Trump administration, the purpose of these sanctions was to actually harm people and get them to overthrow their government, or at least get them out of office somehow. And that's what the sanctions do. And they know this. And people, of course, who want to get rid of the sanctions also know this. And it's pretty difficult to hide this. I think that that's when the sanctions will end, is when everybody knows this. You know, just if I can give one example, a similar example you had in Congress, because you have now, for example, 21 members of Congress have signed a letter just May 1st saying to get rid of the sanctions. And this is historic. This hasn't happened before. 21 members of Congress said, wrote a letter to the administration to get rid of the sanctions on Venezuela and Cuba. And they said, why? Because first of all, they said all the things wrong, but they also said that you have over 400,000 migrants at the border increase, in the last 6 months. And I'm sorry, in the last year, 2022, is 414,000. And that was a 361% increase of the migrants from Venezuela and Cuba. That's what those 400,000 came from. And so that's what so that's going to become an issue in the elections going forward. And I think that's one of the reasons they wrote to Biden, because they know very well. And one of by the way, the lead in the letter was Veronica Escobar, who's a co-chair of Biden's campaign. So it's a serious political issue as well.
Okay. I want to bring in Lula da Silva, the president of Brazil, who was meeting with the president of Venezuela quite recently. Tamara, I know you said that there were issues with governance before the sanctions were applied. This is what President da Silva had to say about those issues and how Maduro is dealing with them.
Is it his fault? No, it's the United States' fault, who made an extremely exaggerated blockade. I always say that a blockade is worse than war, because in a war, usually soldiers in battles die. But a blockade kills children, women, people who have nothing to do with the ideological dispute at play. I dream of a currency different than the dollar, so we can negotiate between the countries who sell to us their products and who buy from us.
Tamara, what do you think has been achieved in the past 15 years because of the sanctions on Venezuela?
Look, I think those statements by President Lula were very unfortunate. And in that same meeting, you had other presidents, including President Boric, who's also from center-left, explaining that there are serious concerns about the human rights situation in Venezuela. So I think we can't oversimplify the Venezuelan crisis and talk about whether it's all or isn't all responsibility of the U.S. sanctions. That's playing into the narrative by Venezuelan officials that have typically blamed someone else for issues for which they are only responsible.
Is it partly the responsibility of the U.S., though? Would you acknowledge that? Partly responsible, because there are migrants turning up on the border of the U.S. because they can't live in Venezuela anymore. So is there some responsibility?
The migration crisis in Venezuela started in 2014. I was in Cucuta at the border interviewing people who were leaving, and they were leaving because of multiple reasons, including the humanitarian situation before the crisis was created by sanctions. So I don't think it's accurate to blame the United States for everything. I do think, as I said, that Trump policies, including the imposition of economic sanctions, have contributed in large part due to overcompliance. But I don't think this is about just blaming someone else. There's a multiplicity of reasons for Venezuela's crisis, and the Venezuelan crisis has three dimensions. It's the refugee crisis, it's the humanitarian crisis, and it's the crackdown on dissent that includes the commission of
just briefly, because I want to bring Francisco in. What I did ask you was what has been achieved, and I also want to add that those sanctions, the US sanctions, began in 2006. So if people turned up on the border in 2014, that's in the same timeline. In a sentence, what's been achieved?
No, it's 2 years before.
2014?
Yeah, 2014 is 2 years before the imposition of economic sanctions on Venezuela. But I'm not here to defend the sanctions imposed by the United States. I just think we need to paint an accurate picture that includes the impact of sanctions, but is not necessarily the only reason why Venezuela is in the disastrous situation that it is today.
Okay,
and I also think it's problematic to...
Sure, Tamara. Go ahead. I'll let you finish the sentence. In the last few minutes of the show, go ahead.
The only thing I wanted to say is, I don't think I think it's important to have this conversation because there's a perception of normalization about the situation in Venezuela that I think we need to overcome and talk about the facts. and not about narratives, as President Lula said in Brasilia recently in that video you showed.
All right, Francisco?
Yeah, I don't think that there is a major disagreement on the diagnosis that sanctions have made an important contribution to Venezuela's economic crisis, but that they're not the sole determinant. I also agree with Tamara that the relevant sanctions, the economic sanctions, were imposed in 2017. But we also have to understand that Venezuela is a country that, since it's highly dependent on oil revenues and oil prices, then anything that changes its oil revenues is going to deeply impact it. So yes, the migration crisis started with full force in 2014 as oil prices started collapsing. Oil prices fell from $100 a barrel to $30 a barrel. Any time in Venezuelan history, in any other oil exporting country, that's going to generate a major economic crisis. And that's what happened between 2014 and 2016. Now, what happened from 2017 on is somewhat different because oil prices started recovering in 2017 and grew by 80% between that moment and 2018. Nevertheless, Venezuela's economy did not recover as it usually did when oil prices recovered, and that's because its oil sector was collapsing. And there's very strong evidence, it's published in many journals, that sanctions have had a very significant effect. But I do want to point out something here which is really important and relates to something that Mark said. There's also very strong published evidence that sanctions have an effect on mortality, as he was saying. And it's not just from the Venezuelan case. Cross-national estimates indicate that a sanctions episode leads to an increase, to a decline of 1.2 years in male life expectancy and 1.4 years in female life expectancy. This is a huge effect on living conditions.
I want to bring in a voice from Venezuela who adds to that concept of we are suffering here because of the sanctions. This is Michelle Elner.
The sanctions regime imposed in Venezuela has led to a sharp decline in national income, the deterioration of public services, and limited access to essentials such as food and medicine. Under such a harsh program, it will be difficult for any government, regardless of their ideology, to find appropriate solutions. And even if the Venezuelan government has implemented unwise policies, it doesn't give the U.S. the right to impose brutal sanctions. I mean, in the U.S., over 40 million people live below the poverty level, while Senator Bob Menendez, one of the main sanctions proponents, faces corruption accusations. Who is sanctioned in the U.S.? Recently, President Trump admitted that his policies towards Venezuela were aimed at seizing its oil. It is unacceptable for any nation to weaponize their power against less privileged nations. The suffering that tactics like these have caused to innocent people is simply unforgivable.
Mark, you've got to start it off in this conversation. Generally, politically, do sanctions work?
Can I say something about that?
Go ahead, Mark. Do sanctions work?
Yeah. Well, I mean, they work if the purpose is, as Pompeo explained it, to make people suffer and make the government more unpopular. But I want to focus for just 1 minute on the economics of this, because I think this will clarify some of the
we have 1 minute, Mark, so make it brief but impactful.
Well, the hyperinflation is a really big thing. That's a huge part of this gigantic record decline in the Venezuelan economy. And that was caused by the sanctions.
Right.
And you can see that because the typical hyperinflation in Latin America since World War II has lasted 4 months, and Venezuela's has lasted 3 years. And that's only after the sanctions.
Thanks,
and that's
Mark.
why.
I'm going to leave us with the voice of President Maduro, who is hopeful that by 2024, when elections happen in Venezuela, the sanctions will be lifted. Have a listen, have a look.
We are going to discuss because we want free elections, free of sanctions, free of unilateral coercive measures. The elections will be free of sanctions. There is no other option. That is the dilemma. Do you want free, fair, and transparent elections? Then they must be elections free of sanctions.
Thank you for your comments on YouTube, viewers, and thank you, Francisco, Tamara, and Mark, for being part of our program today. Appreciate you. Take care, everybody. I'll see you next time.